Welcome, TJ. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time to be here and talk about addiction and root cause issues and recovery.
Well, thank you, B. I love being in this conversation, so I'm incredibly grateful for this time together.
Awesome. So I came across your work a few months ago. I was so struck by everything that you said. Literally, I tried to write it down and it ended up just being a transcription of everything you were saying. So I knew as soon as I kind of got into listening to you in that summit, I really wanted to have you come and share with this community. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And while you deal with addiction recovery as an area of specialty, listening to you talk, it's very clear that so many of the things that you're talking about are relevant to the human experience in terms of what people are challenged by, and then how far that goes in terms of symptoms and challenges, right?
Absolutely. And certainly I have the book Conscious Recovery, which does focus on addiction. I have a couple other books that aren't specific to it. But I think for all of us as human beings, we experience things in our life that may cause us to separate from our true nature. And then once we separate from that true nature, we start to believe lies about ourselves. And that becomes a frequency, that becomes a point of view and an energy. And then we start seeing that everywhere in the world. And for many of us, we then look to someone or something outside of ourselves to try to feel whole again. And by that, in that way, I think all of us could at least identify that it could be an addiction if we're looking for something outside of ourselves.
Completely, right? Whether it's drugs, alcohol, love, sex, shopping, entertainment, the grass is greener, whatever, and to whatever degree that becomes a problem. So there were so many things in what you just said. So the separation, right? The separation from who we are. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what that means to you and how you see that playing out?
Yeah, I've identified one of the root causes of addiction. And remember that this could apply to all of us. I think we're addicted right now in our world. We're kind of addicted to drama and division. That's one thing that I see us addicted to. So for any of us that have any sort of outward seeking, which I think is a broad enough umbrella, I've identified one of the root causes as spiritual disconnection. And so what do I mean by that? We come into this world very deeply connected with our true nature. It's innate in the human experience to be present, to be open, to be loving, to be kind. And then we get programmed to believe many different lies about the world and about ourselves. And then we separate from that true nature. And to me, that is the attachment. That's the core attachment wound, right? We are really deeply connected with ourselves. We come into the world, we need to have love and connection from at least one caregiver. Some of us don't get that. Some of us get that sometimes. Some of us get that, and then we have some kind of traumatic event like a divorce or a loss that causes us to then separate from our true nature.
Got it. And then we're no longer living as these connected, loving, open beings. Our hearts close up a little bit, seize up a little bit, and we're now living in essentially trauma and conditioning.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I think trauma is a word we're using a lot. And that's one of the other, I've identified trauma or unresolved trauma as another root cause of addiction. And we talk about it a lot now in our culture. And sometimes when we hear trauma, we might think of something very specific, like the loss of a parent or sexual abuse or physical abuse, war. And while all those things certainly are trauma, again, we have a much broader umbrella. And for me, anytime we were seen as other than a whole and perfect spiritual being, that is a traumatic event. And that's not to minimize what someone might have that we would consider a serious trauma, but there's a framework, big T, little t trauma. And I just want to name, I'm not a big fan of that framework because we end up comparing ourselves. I had an event that happened when I was in kindergarten that seemed so insignificant to some, but it was so significant to me that I decided in that moment that I was stupid. And that core belief was with me for then at least 30 years that I walked around with that. So even though someone else sitting right next to me might say, well, that's not traumatic, for me it was. And so in that way, I think it's important that we don't compare our own trauma to someone else's.
Agreed. And what is traumatic for a 3-year-old is pretty much anything that is not a full-on embraced, loving acceptance.
Right? That's right.
Which is why we have a planet full of adults that are traumatized to some degree through the conditioning or through big T events, right? Big trauma events. Right. So these three roots of addiction, which I think is a really great framework for understanding how we get into a situation of addiction. So you mentioned spiritual disconnection, makes total sense. Unresolved trauma. Third one?
Third one is toxic shame. And shame is another conversation that's really alive in our culture. I hearken back to going back to John Bradshaw's work in the 80s. He wrote a book, Healing the Shame That Binds You. And when I read that book, it all came into focus for me because I didn't really understand what shame meant and how that was different than guilt. And as I started reading his book, I realized that I had been walking around believing I was broken or damaged. And I think if there's any pandemic that's really present throughout many cultures on planet Earth right now, it's shame. We have religious systems, school systems, family systems that really end up casting shame on people and having people feel shame and believe there's something fundamentally wrong with them. And so it's no wonder that we're walking around trying to find relief outside of ourselves, like we have our umbilical cord in our hand, simply trying to be fed, really. And that shame core creates all sorts of absurd behaviors. And of course, I think the behaviors are, as I said earlier, trying to feel whole again. There's nothing wrong with the behaviors. The issue is it just doesn't work, at least not long term.
Got it. And so the shame, so am I right? And when I hear you talk about that, you're saying that the shame is essentially, no matter what's gone on in my life and what I've done or what I've experienced, the shame is coming from I am wrong. I am in my innate nature on this planet, born onto this planet, broken, and there's something wrong with me.
That's right. And how many times have we heard ourselves say, or our friends say, in my case, clients say, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm damaged. I'm not worthy. I'm not lovable. I mean, we could add to that list. And that sense of brokenness is at the core, I think, of, I think it's the trauma creates the disconnection, creates the shame. And I put them in that order for a specific reason, because we end up walking around feeling wounded. And some of us actually believe, I worked with a client once that said, I don't care what you say, you're not going to convince me that I'm whole and perfect. I assure you I'm broken. And it took 3 years for him one day to say, with tears in his eyes, oh my gosh, you're right. I'm not broken. There are parts of me that feel broken. There are parts of my story that had led me to that sense of feeling that, but fundamentally, that's not who and what I am.
Yes. And I think there's a beautiful distinction, actually really honoring the difference, because the feeling of brokenness is a hell of a real, right? It's super real for people, but it's the intellectualizing that the feeling is not who you are and the experience is not who you are, which is very intellectual to start with, right? But as you go through the healing and recovery process, I'm guessing you're coming closer to an embodied experience of it versus, okay, I hear the words and you're telling me and I get it, but it's not my reality. So can you talk about, and with that understanding, these are the things that happen to us, and we go through these sorts of three things. We experience this disconnection, we're walking around with shame and trauma, and then that drives us in our lives to all sorts of certain behaviors to try to fix the way that we're then feeling. So that shows up in lots of ways, right? And can you talk about that from an addiction point of view?
Yeah, if we're walking around with a core belief, and I'll just choose one, if I'm walking around with a belief that I'm not lovable, it's much more than just a belief. And I think that's an important distinction. Of course, we have these core false beliefs that we're walking around with, but it's not really just a cognitive issue. In other words, it's not just a thought, it's a core frequency, it's a core vibration. So if I'm walking around with this belief and this frequency, this vibration that I'm not lovable, not only am I going to attract situations to confirm that belief, but I'm going to be attracted to them. Now, this is the great news. This isn't the bad news for me. This is actually the wonderful news, because I realized at some point that it's really not about what's happening outside of me. It's really about that core vibration, not from a place of self-criticism or blame, but from a place of curiosity and openness. Oh, wow, what is it about these relationships that I keep choosing? Not why do I keep choosing them? Because I think why do I keep choosing them can keep us in sort of a victim mentality. But what is it about these relationships? What is that there? What's that pull? And when I recognize that it's simply the congruency with the vibration, then I recognize that I can unplug from the relationship, the work situation, the drug, the alcohol, the shopping, the eating, and I can start to work on that core vibration. And as I start to heal that, the world starts to, it seems to respond, and it does respond, but I think a deeper awareness of it is really that I start to choose something different, because I can only create the life I believe I deserve. So if I believe I'm unlovable, I will consistently, I can walk into a room and feel into the person that's going to confirm that. They might be wonderful people. Maybe they're unavailable in some way, but if I'm in that core frequency, so the bottom line is we unplug from the behavior or the symptom, the relationship, and we start to heal where that wound originated, not our brokenness because we're whole and perfect, but that place within us that still feels wounded.
And I've heard you, there's two things I've heard you say, which is just, I think most people will really resonate with, and it's a great analogy. And that is walking around with your umbilical cord in your hand, looking for something to plug into.
Yes.
To fill you up, whether it's with just love or sense of acceptance or whatever it is. And, you know, when I heard you say that from talking about an addiction point of view, it's really interesting because to some degree, everybody's doing that, right? To some degree, but it's just the degrees of. So there's so many similarities between people who may be experiencing what you might term an addiction to people that are not experiencing what society calls an addiction, but are actually just having the same experience to magnified or played out in really different ways. And you've walked this path, right? You understand conscious recovery because you've walked it yourself. Is that right?
That's right. And I had a lot of addiction early in my life. And even going back when I was a little kid, I remember being filled with joy and awe and wonder, connection. Everything that we think we're going to get from a spiritual practice is actually innate in the human experience. Joy, openness, connection, calm, you know, all of that was my experience. And then through a series of events called Life on Planet Earth, I started to believe I was broken. I'm unlovable. I'm unworthy. I'm not good enough. So by the time I was 13 or 14, when I discovered drugs and alcohol, I was ready for relief. Now, here's something that's interesting about what you said, and I think it ties into my own story. We don't call it an addiction as long as it's working. We call it fun. We call it relief. We call it a loving relationship, right? So there's nothing inherently right or wrong about any kind of external behavior. The question, though, is it actually an outer search for something that really needs to happen within? This is why we hear people use the term the honeymoon phase, right? We're in the euphoria of a new relationship, which feels really wonderful. And it is wonderful. And if I haven't done a lot of my own healing, that person will disappoint me at some point because no one can actually do my work for me. You know, we talk about attracting unavailable people. And my friend Marianne Williamson says, it's not about do we attract unavailable people? It's are we attracted to them? And then I take it a step further and ask the question, what am I wanting them to be available for? If I feel broken and I'm looking for someone to bring relief from that, even if it's not conscious, I assure you that person will disappoint me at some point because human beings can't do that for us. Now, when we're in a relationship with self where we're healing, there's no finish line. But when I'm in the process of returning to my wholeness, which we could call healing, then I'm in a relationship in a very different way. Yes, there's an exchange of love. Yes, I'm relying on my partner. Yes, I want to receive love from them, but I'm not saying they must do that so that I can be happy. That's a fundamental different way of being in the world and in relationships.
Fascinating. And I can see how, I mean, the relationships is a really good example because that's one of the most common ways that we seek to have our identity reflected back to us, or we seek to feel accepted and bonded, or we seek to fill ourselves with love as via our relationships with people, right? And before we started recording this, I said to you, I've been using as a mantra over and over something I heard you say on either on a call that I listened to, or maybe I read. I've been absorbing your materials. Everything is love, or a request for love. And if you really sit with that, that is shockingly transforms your view of all your interactions with everybody all the time.
That's right. Yeah, I love that. It's really powerful. And I appreciate that you paused for a moment and leaned into it, because that sounds wonderful, right? Everything's love or request for love. But when I really lean into that and say, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. That means, and I'll start with the I, and then I'll look at other relationships. So for me, everything that I was doing, whether that was using drugs or whether that was what we would, call my addiction to unavailable men in relationships, whatever it was, that was some sort, in some way, that was a request for love. It wasn't what the old, we often have heard everything is love or fear. Now, I understand that, and in some ways that works, but I think the deeper approach is everything is love or a request for love. Now, mostly not conscious, right? Like I wasn't choosing unavailable people and saying, maybe I was in that case saying, please love me. I wasn't using drugs. So I was saying, oh my gosh, right now, the request is that I feel love. It's often unconscious. Mm-hmm. When I have compassion for myself, I can have compassion for others. We talked about shame, and one key point to shame is when the shame is unresolved within me, I will unconsciously look for it in the world. In other words, if I feel broken, I will see it everywhere.
Yes.
So if I shift to what is the request for love here, that is with my own behavior and with others, then I can say, oh, wow, let me be curious about that, rather than pushing up against what we might call fear or unavailability, or, we talk about toxic relationships now. There are a lot of different ways we use this as a framework.
And I think I really tested this out when I was running it over and over in my head. Everything is love or a request for love. And so I'm interacting with people, I'm having conversations, I'm out and about in daily life, and I'm observing people, and I'm looking at the divisiveness in the world, and there's hate over here, and there's lack of understanding or listening and communication. I'm like, how is this a request for love? But actually, when you look at it, hate comes out of someone in a moment because that's what they're experiencing within, and it is not the human nature to want to dwell in that state. And every single person on the planet wants to be seen, heard, loved, accepted, bonded, and understood. And those things drive all of these other challenges that we're seeing, right? And so it's just, for me, I think if you really get into the nitty-gritty of that statement, which I just adore from you, it holds true. It really holds true. And
when I'm curious about that, things shift really dramatically. I look at coalitions, right? Groups of people that come together around an ideology. Now, I might have a strong agreement or disagreement with the ideology, and the similarities to it are we want to find our tribe, right? We want to find people, I've been talking a lot lately about the term like-minded. We often say I want to find a group of like-minded people. And I actually am not looking for a group of like-minded people. And I'm going to share why. If I look for people that agree with me, then we create groups around that. And it's very easy at that point to then create the other.
Yes.
So if I say, this is what I believe, this is what we believe, and we come together in that belief, we find ourselves having friction or even war with other people. But when I recognize I have thoughts, but I'm not my thoughts, I'm looking for a group of people, and I surround myself with people that are not like-minded or not even necessarily like-hearted. I'm looking for people to surround myself with that are dedicated to knowing oneness, to knowing our essential beingness, to knowing our infinite potential, to recognizing what you said so beautifully, to look for the request for love instead of what's wrong about this. Mm-hmm. So I think we're in a profound moment in human history where we have some decisions to make as individuals and collectively.
Agreed. And I also don't like the like-minded statement and try not to use it, only because I think my mind is very fallible and it has been filled with all sorts of programming. So I would really prefer someone who's vibrationally aligned with the exploration of consciousness.
Wow, say that. Will you say that again? That's powerful.
It's a very long-winded way of saying
I love it.
But the other thing that I was thinking about as you were saying that, no, it's gone. It might come back. It's just curiosity. When I first heard you speak, and I came across you on Zach's webinar before Christmas, Dr. Zach Bush's webinar, and then the use of the term curiosity is perfection, because what it is I must let go of rigid opinionation and holding to beliefs and strong driving down my path of my paradigm. I must loosen that. I must loosen my perspective a little to be curious. And that's like a softening. And to me, that softening, that curiosity is that kind of feminine energy of an openness of willingness, not feminine as in female, not masculine as in male, but a loosening of the driving, I know everything and I know what I need, I know what I want, to just say, what if we don't know? And like you say, looking at people in an addiction situation, can you just share about the way one of the healing things that happens when you address people and you see people in a different way?
Well, first of all, I love and applaud everything you just said, because I think that is at the root of the infinite possibilities of our time. Because looking back for thousands of years, most of us have believed we are our opinions. And because of that, we have been deeply entrenched in our point of view, usually not even conscious. And then we're at war with other people, right? Then, when we opinionate at people, we create more friction, we create more war, we create more division. And what's being asked of us, because for me, the way I say it is, I don't think we're living in a divided or divisive world. I think, or polarized, let's say polarized. Maybe we're not living in a polarized world. It's really, we've been conditioned to have polarized thinking, good, bad, right, wrong, us, them. And that there's nothing wrong with that, because I want to take the wrongness out of it, but ask the question, what does it create in the world? Well, we know what it creates, right? We can go on to any social media platform, and if we're not conscious about our algorithm, we can see that divisiveness just being poured out. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. And so curiosity opens us up. As it relates to addiction, part of it is, I think the last thing you said is, what does it create based on the way I see someone, right? It's easy to look at someone who has an addiction as wrong or bad in some way. Even counselors and therapists have been trained to look for what's wrong and how do they help them? How do they provide tools? And I think that is useful to a degree, but then it becomes limited. When we move into curiosity, we start asking open-ended questions that actually expand our consciousness rather than keeping us stuck in our program. In some ways, it becomes so simple, but there's the difference between a simple concept and actually practicing these simple concepts. And that's where our life starts to shift, and it can shift dramatically and quickly.
And I've heard you talk about, like, you can behold the wholeness in a person. For someone who thinks they're broken, for somebody to sit with them and acknowledge and see and hold the energy of, I don't believe you're broken, I believe you are whole. It's so profoundly shocking when you think you're broken that and what you're talking about before is sort of like looking at humanity and the planet and society as not broken. But then on an individual level with addiction or people that are struggling in whatever area of their life, to also do the same thing. What is the lens through which we're looking at humanity? What is the lens through which we're looking at individuals? Is it broken, or is there a wholeness and there's some manifesting symptoms making it look broken?
Yeah, and you're really speaking to the core of conscious recovery, which is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that's whole and perfect. And you used, I think, the most important word in this is holding the energy of viewing someone, right? It is a lens, it is a thought, but ultimately it's the energy, right? we mostly communicate energetically. Little babies, for example, our brains aren't even developed, so we're purely aware of the energy around us. Even as animals, animals instinctively are related to energy. Equine therapy, working with horses, helps someone realize that you can be connected with that horse energetically. So that was a long way of saying it's really what I'm actually holding about the person, not so much what I'm thinking. And when I go into treatment programs, for example, and I train clinicians, the training is really to notice when the person is talking. Let's say I'm facilitating a group or I'm in an individual session, the person's talking and I'm responding in my mind, or I'm diagnosing in my mind. If I can say, wow, let me look for the place within them that is whole, there's a place of wholeness, and let me hold that energetically, we start to see profound shifts. Nikola Tesla said something that I've been leaning into. He said, the moment we start studying non-physical phenomena, we will make more progress in a decade than the previous centuries. Because we tend to only focus on the physical. We see that with viruses, we see that with addiction, we see that with mental health issues. We're looking only at the physical. So what Tesla is inviting us to look at is what many of us know, that that's such a small piece of it. There's so much more happening. When we become curious about non-physical phenomena, our life really shifts into a new way of being and seeing.
Super powerful, isn't it? And so you're training clinicians, and then are you doing treatment recovery, conscious recovery with people directly, or are you mainly training treatment centers to apply your method?
At this point, I'm training clinicians just because my schedule is so busy. I go into treatment programs, they adopt the conscious recovery curriculum. It's so much more than a curriculum. Yes, it's a book, it's a workbook, it's a journal, it's interactive groups that I've created, but mostly it's this idea or this way of being with holding the wholeness within a client. And that's really what I feel so blessed, because then it's a ripple effect, right? There are clients that get touched by this that I'm never going to actually meet. And that's, I think, consciousness itself, right? We're all participating moment to moment in contributing to collective consciousness.
Yeah. And when you just listen to you talk about that, when you think about it's not the thoughts you're having about the person, it's like the space you're holding and the energy that you're holding about that person. And as you say, because I've heard you say it and I've read it in your work, you behold the wholeness in this person. It reminded me of the consciousness experiments of quantum physics, where the way that your consciousness perceives something shifts to something. It creates a change in reality. Like, it's that powerful. It really is, like you said earlier, it can be simple, but it really is that powerful. And for me, when I hear you talk about this, the way that you're bringing this work to something like addiction, it's like God's work. It's like the work of love, right?
Well, that's certainly the intention. And it's because, going back to my own story, when I was around 18 months or 2 years sober, I was suicidal. I hadn't addressed the trauma. I did believe I was broken. I was deeply disconnected with myself and trying so desperately to connect to the world, which could not possibly fulfill me. And I was at a place where I was suicidal. And I met a woman named Mary Helen, who literally changed my life, not by what she taught me, but how she was being with me, her presence, her openness. She was a beautiful Southern woman, and she would say, "Darling, you're so precious." And I would literally recoil from that because it was incongruent with my vibration. But as I continued to be in her world and in her sphere of influence, which was her energy, I started to ask myself, well, if she sees me as precious, who am I not to? And then I also started to access, and this is quantum physics, right? She's not telling me you're not broken. She's holding it for me. And then I start to feel that spark within me. She literally, through her consciousness, not created, I mean, maybe she did create that in me, but really she helped me open up to access that was already in there. I already, beneath all of that brokenness or belief in brokenness, there was still this whole imperfect, precious being.
Absolutely. And she was like a light to guide you to that. And I'm hearing you talk and I'm thinking of the very famous quote from Marianne Williamson's book, A Return to Love. There's something about who am I not to?
Right.
fabulous, magnificent, all of the good things. And a lot of the things we've talked about also remind me of A Course in Miracles. I've been studying that as a student for 6 or 7 years, and I used to listen a lot to Marianne's lectures. And there's amazing lessons in there, like I loosen the world of all I thought it was, and this whole defense attack, and my defense listens to my safety lies. And it's the same thing. It's like beholding the purity and the light and the wholeness within you that's always been there.
Right.
So, love everything about this. Can you tell me, how can people learn more about your work? You've got books, you've also got online courses.
Yeah, I think the best place to start is my Instagram. So it's TJ_Woodward_. And then in the bio, there's a link that will take you to all the courses, the books, Conscious Recovery, my new book, Conscious Creation, that came out a few months ago. So yeah, Instagram is the best place to start. And at this point, what I'm dedicated to doing is being, it's interesting. It's like being Mary Helen in the world, because, she made her transition in 1998. And when she died, it wasn't the very last thing she said, but the last thing she said to me when I saw her was some version of, you're very extroverted. She was saying to me, she was a very introverted person. She never spoke. She never led a group. It was always one-on-one. And she said, you're really extroverted. And you're going to take this message to a much larger audience. And it was as if she invited me to take her life's work, which really is universal, right? It's universal life work. These truths have been around for thousands of years, and take it out and let people know. So that's really a long way of saying I offer courses, there's books, there's workbooks, and I'm really delighted to be part of ushering in, along with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of others who are really entering this new paradigm of oneness and wholeness.
So beautiful. And anything I can do to support your work reaching people, I would absolutely, because there's every cell of my body is like, yes, about everything that you're sharing. And I know there's people in my community who have addiction. There are people in my community that are concerned that they have addiction without anybody saying they have addiction. And there are people that are just, as you say, walking around with their umbilical cord in their hand, looking for somewhere to plug it into, as we all have been at some point on this journey. So I'll be really glad to make sure that your website's listed and your Instagram and your fabulous books and courses. And I'm extremely grateful to have met you. And I thank you for saying yes when I reached out to you randomly out of the blue to come and share this time, because it's been a treasure for me. I don't know about anybody else, but it's been very good for me.
And that's it, right? It's wonderful for us to be in this conversation. And I feel this vibrational frequency congruency with you. And so I'm incredibly grateful.